My future daughter-in-law said something I never imagined hearing from my own family. Daniel thinks it would be better if you didn't come to the wedding. Margaret Collins heard those words on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in her small apartment on the Upper West Side of New York, and for a long moment, she simply stared out the window at the slow traffic moving along Broadway, as if the city itself might explain what she had just heard. The voice on the phone belonged to Emily Parker, the woman Daniel planned to marry in just a few days, and although Emily spoke calmly, almost politely, the sentence hung in the air like something heavy and impossible to move. Margaret didn't interrupt her. She didn't argue. She simply listened, the way she had learned to listen through 38 years of being Daniel's mother. Across the street, a delivery truck stopped at the curb and a man carried a stack of boxes into a bakery Margaret had visited for years. It was the same bakery where she had once bought a chocolate cake for Daniel's 10th birthday. She remembered the way he had run through the kitchen of their old house in Queens, laughing, his sneakers squeaking on the tile floor while she tried to light the candles before he saw the cake. That memory appeared in her mind with such clarity that for a second it felt more real than the conversation happening on the phone. Emily continued speaking, explaining things carefully, almost as if she were discussing a seating chart or a catering detail. She said the wedding in Manhattan was going to be very intimate, and that Daniel didn't want any tension on such an important day. Margaret heard every word. What surprised her most was not the message itself, but how rehearsed it sounded, as if the decision had been discussed many times before this phone call. She thought about Daniel as a boy again, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while she worked a second job in the evenings to make sure he could attend a good college one day. She remembered winter mornings when she walked him to the subway before sunrise so he wouldn't miss the train to school. Back then Daniel used to hold her hand the entire way down the block. Margaret blinked slowly and returned her attention to Emily's voice. The younger woman was still talking, describing how stressful wedding planning had been, mentioning vendors and reservations and the guest list at the venue near Central Park. Margaret knew the place. She had actually helped pay the deposit for that reception hall 6 months earlier when Daniel told her the cost was higher than expected. She had written the check without hesitation. At the time she imagined herself sitting near the front table, watching her son smile as he started a new chapter of his life. Now Emily was gently explaining why it would be simpler for everyone if Margaret stayed home that day. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Margaret glanced toward the small wooden shelf where framed photographs of Daniel stood beside a silver clock. One photo showed him graduating from Columbia University, wearing a dark blue gown and grinning widely while his arm rested around her shoulders. She remembered the exact moment that picture was taken, the bright spring sun and the way Daniel had said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. She thanked Emily for letting her know. She said she understood that weddings could be complicated. And as she placed the phone gently back on the kitchen counter, she realized something that hadn't crossed her mind before that moment. The wedding Daniel was about to have in Manhattan was a celebration she had quietly helped build from the beginning. Yet somehow she had become the only person who wasn't meant to be there. Margaret Collins remained standing in her quiet kitchen for several minutes after the call ended, her hand resting lightly on the counter as if she needed the solid wood beneath her palm to remind herself where she was. Outside the window, the afternoon sun had begun to move behind the tall buildings across the street, casting long shadows along the sidewalk, where people hurried past carrying grocery bags and coffee cups. Life in New York continued at its usual fast pace, but inside Margaret's apartment, everything seemed to slow down. She walked slowly toward the small round table near the window and sat down in the chair where she usually drank her morning tea. The same table had once been covered with school forms, college brochures, and stacks of bills when Daniel was growing up. For a long time, Margaret had believed that every sacrifice she made had helped build a better life for her son. She remembered the years after her husband passed away when Daniel was only 17. Those were not easy years. Margaret worked long shifts at a community hospital in Manhattan, sometimes leaving the apartment before sunrise and returning well after dark. The subway ride alone took nearly 40 minutes each way, but she never complained because she knew Daniel was studying hard and dreaming about attending a good university. When the acceptance letter from Columbia University arrived in the mail, Daniel had run down the hallway holding the envelope above his head like a trophy. Margaret could still hear his voice echoing in the small apartment as he shouted that they had done it. He had said the word they instead of I, and that small detail had always meant everything to her. Over the years, Margaret helped him in quiet ways that Daniel rarely noticed. When he found his first job in Midtown and struggled to afford rent, Margaret quietly transferred money into his account each month so he could stay in the city he loved. When he spoke about proposing to Emily Parker 2 years earlier, Margaret listened carefully as he described the restaurant where he planned to ask the question and the small diamond ring he had chosen. She remembered smiling at the excitement in his voice. Later that week, she wrote another check to help cover the cost of the wedding venue because Daniel sounded worried about the deposit. He had promised he would repay her eventually, but Margaret had never expected that money to return. To her, it was simply another way of helping her son start the next chapter of his life. Sitting at the kitchen table now, Margaret looked toward the refrigerator where a printed invitation still hung under a small magnet shaped like the Statue of Liberty. It had arrived 3 months earlier with elegant gold lettering announcing the ceremony in Manhattan. Margaret had placed it on the refrigerator door because she liked seeing it every day. It reminded her that something joyful was coming. Slowly she stood up and walked across the room, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. She studied the invitation again, reading Daniel's name and Emily Parker's name side by side in graceful script. For a moment, she wondered how long the decision to exclude her had existed before that phone call. Perhaps it had been discussed during one of the many planning meetings she had never attended. Perhaps Daniel had convinced himself that avoiding conflict was easier than defending his mother. Margaret did not know the answer. What she did know was that the wedding scheduled to take place in only a few days had already changed in a way no one else seemed to understand. She gently removed the invitation from the refrigerator door and placed it on the kitchen table beside her. The paper felt smooth and expensive beneath her fingertips. Then she quietly reached for her phone again, not to argue or complain, but to review something she had not thought about in months, a detail connected to the arrangements Daniel and Emily believed were already settled. Margaret Collins unlocked her phone and opened the email application slowly, her eyes calm but focused in the quiet kitchen light. The screen illuminated the small room as the late afternoon sun faded behind the tall buildings across the street. She searched for a particular message she remembered receiving nearly 6 months earlier, the one from the event coordinator at the Manhattan venue Daniel and Emily had chosen for the wedding reception. Margaret had not thought much about that message at the time because she trusted her son completely, but now every detail felt different. She tapped the message and read it again carefully. The subject line was simple and professional, thanking her for confirming the payment for the reception deposit. Margaret remembered the day clearly. Daniel had sounded nervous during their phone call that evening, explaining that the venue required a substantial deposit to secure the date in early autumn. The amount had been significant, several $1,000s, but Margaret had not hesitated. She had told Daniel that weddings happened only once in a lifetime and that he should not begin his marriage worried about money. The next morning, she visited her bank branch on Columbus Avenue and arranged the transfer herself. At the time, she imagined the reception hall filled with music, laughter, and the warm glow of celebration as friends and family gathered to honor the beginning of Daniel's new life. Now, sitting at the kitchen table, Margaret scrolled slowly through the email and noticed something she had overlooked before. Beneath the confirmation of the payment was a line stating that the primary financial contact for the reservation remained Margaret Collins until final arrangements were completed. She paused when she read that sentence. It was not dramatic. It was not threatening. It was simply a detail written in polite administrative language, but it carried meaning she had not considered until this moment. Margaret placed the phone gently on the table and leaned back in her chair. The apartment remained quiet except for the distant hum of traffic drifting through the partially open window. She thought about the conversation with Emily again, about the careful tone and the explanation that the wedding would be easier without her presence. The words had sounded final, almost as if Margaret were only a distant relative who might complicate an otherwise perfect event. Yet the reality was different in ways Daniel and Emily may not have fully understood. Margaret stood up and walked toward the narrow hallway that led to her bedroom. Along the wall hung several framed photographs taken over the years, moments from Daniel's childhood and early adulthood. One picture showed him standing proudly beside the first car he had purchased after college, a modest sedan that Margaret had quietly helped him afford with a small loan he had eventually forgotten about. Another photo showed Daniel and Emily together during a summer weekend trip to Long Island, smiling in front of the ocean as if the future had already unfolded exactly the way they wanted. Margaret stopped in front of that photograph and studied Emily's confident expression. She did not feel anger. Instead, she felt a slow clarity forming in her mind, the kind that arrives when someone finally understands the shape of a situation that once seemed confusing. Returning to the kitchen, she picked up her phone again and opened the contact information for the event coordinator listed in the email. The woman's name was Rebecca Lawson, and Margaret remembered speaking with her briefly during the initial booking process months earlier. Rebecca had been polite and efficient, explaining the policies and confirming the details of the reservation. Margaret looked at the phone number on the screen for a moment, considering the quiet chain of events that had led to this afternoon. Daniel and Emily believed their plans were already secure, that every detail of the reception had been settled long ago. What they did not realize was that Margaret Collins still held a position in the arrangement that no one had mentioned during that brief phone call earlier in the day. She took a slow breath, then saved the number to her favorites list before setting the phone down beside the invitation on the table, understanding that the coming days might unfold very differently than anyone expected. Margaret Collins waited until the next morning before doing anything else, not because she was uncertain, but because she had always believed that important decisions should be made with a clear mind and steady hands. The early sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of her apartment, casting a pale glow across the kitchen floor as she prepared her usual breakfast of toast and coffee. The routine felt grounding. For years, Margaret had begun her days the same way before catching the subway to the hospital where she once worked long shifts, and even now, after retirement, those small habits remained. She sat at the round table near the window and watched the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood waking up below. A woman walked a golden retriever along the sidewalk. A taxi stopped briefly at the corner before merging back into traffic. It was an ordinary morning in New York, the kind that reminded Margaret how quickly time passed in a city that never seemed to slow down for anyone. After finishing her coffee, she reached for her phone again and opened the email from Rebecca Lawson one more time. The polite language of the message still stood there exactly as it had the night before, confirming that Margaret Collins was listed as the primary financial contact for the reception reservation. That simple detail carried weight, even if Daniel and Emily had forgotten about it during the months of wedding planning. Margaret did not feel bitterness as she considered this fact. Instead, she felt something quieter, something more thoughtful. She remembered how excited Daniel had sounded when he first described the venue. He had said the reception hall overlooked a stretch of the Hudson River and that the evening lights reflecting off the water would make the celebration unforgettable. Margaret had listened carefully during that conversation, imagining the room filled with family members sharing stories about Daniel's childhood and wishing him well in the future. At the time, she had believed she would be part of that room. She stood up from the table and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept a neat stack of documents and old notebooks. From the top drawer, she removed a folder labeled simply with the word wedding. Inside were printed emails, payment confirmations, and a copy of the deposit receipt from the bank. Margaret reviewed the papers slowly, not searching for anything dramatic, only reminding herself of the quiet role she had played in helping the event move forward. After several minutes, she returned the documents to the folder and placed it carefully back into the drawer. Then she picked up her phone and scrolled to the contact she had saved the night before. Rebecca Lawson. Margaret hesitated only briefly before pressing the call button. The line rang twice before a warm professional voice answered from the other end. Margaret introduced herself politely and explained that she was calling to confirm a few details regarding the reservation for the upcoming reception. Rebecca recognized the name immediately and thanked Margaret again for assisting with the original deposit months earlier. The conversation remained calm and respectful as Margaret asked a few practical questions about the policies connected to the booking. Rebecca explained that the reservation was still tied to the original financial contact unless a formal transfer had been completed. Margaret listened carefully to every word, her voice steady as she thanked Rebecca for the clarification. When the call ended, Margaret placed the phone back on the table and looked once more at the invitation lying beside it. The elegant gold lettering still announced a celebration that would take place in only a few days, but Margaret understood now that the situation surrounding that event was not as simple as Daniel and Emily believed. She folded her hands quietly and gazed out the window again, knowing that the next steps she chose would shape how the coming weekend unfolded for everyone involved. Margaret Collins spent the rest of that morning moving through her apartment with the quiet rhythm of someone who had already made an important decision but felt no need to rush the outcome. The folder labeled wedding remained in the drawer of her desk, yet the conversation she had just had with Rebecca Lawson lingered clearly in her mind. The event coordinator had spoken in the calm professional tone of someone accustomed to complicated family arrangements, carefully explaining the policies tied to large reservations in Manhattan venues. Margaret had listened closely while Rebecca described how the financial contact remained responsible for confirming final details before the event could proceed exactly as scheduled. It was not a threat, and it was not dramatic. It was simply a procedural fact, one that had existed quietly behind the scenes since the day Margaret walked into her bank on Columbus Avenue to authorize the original transfer. Around midday, Margaret decided to take a short walk outside. The autumn air carried a crisp chill that New Yorkers recognized as the early sign that summer had finally faded. She stepped onto the sidewalk and began walking slowly toward Riverside Park, passing small shops and neighborhood cafes she had known for years. People moved past her in every direction, some heading to offices, others pushing strollers or walking dogs. None of them knew anything about the conversation that had taken place in her kitchen the day before. To them, Margaret Collins was simply another older woman enjoying a quiet morning walk in the city. Yet as she continued along the tree-lined path near the river, her thoughts returned again to Daniel. She remembered the pride she felt the first time he invited her to visit his apartment after he started working in Midtown. The place had been small but bright, with a view of the skyline that made him feel successful. He had shown her the kitchen, the living room, even the narrow balcony where he kept 2 small chairs and a plant that never seemed to grow. Margaret had sat there with him that afternoon, drinking iced tea while he spoke excitedly about the future. That was the day he first mentioned Emily Parker. He described her as confident, organized, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life. Margaret had smiled and told him she was happy that he had found someone who made him feel hopeful. As Margaret reached a bench overlooking the Hudson River, she paused and sat down, watching a ferry move slowly across the water toward the New Jersey shoreline. The steady motion of the boat reminded her how life often carried people forward without giving them time to examine every decision along the way. Daniel had built his life quickly in New York, meeting new colleagues, forming new relationships, and planning a wedding that now seemed carefully arranged around a future that did not include his mother. Margaret did not feel anger as she thought about that reality. Instead, she felt the same calm clarity that had settled over her the moment Emily spoke those words on the phone. After a few minutes, she stood up and began walking back toward her apartment. By the time she reached her building, the afternoon sun had shifted westward, casting a warm glow across the brick facades along the street. Margaret entered the lobby, greeted the doorman with a polite smile, and rode the elevator quietly to her floor. Inside her apartment, the invitation still rested on the kitchen table beside her phone. She looked at it again briefly before picking up the device and opening her email application. Rebecca Lawson had already sent a follow-up message confirming the details they discussed earlier that morning. Margaret read it once, then closed her eyes for a moment as if placing the final pieces of a puzzle into their proper position. Daniel and Emily believed the wedding day would unfold exactly as planned, surrounded by friends, music, and celebration. What they did not yet realize was that the quiet woman sitting alone in a modest Upper West Side apartment still held a role in those plans that had never been formally removed, and the decision about how that role would be exercised had not yet been revealed. Margaret Collins woke early on Friday morning, 2 days before the ceremony that was supposed to unite Daniel and Emily in front of their closest friends and family. The apartment was still quiet, the city outside only beginning to stir as the first buses rolled along Broadway, and a delivery truck stopped briefly at the corner grocery store. Margaret moved through her usual routine with steady patience, preparing coffee and placing a slice of toast on a small plate at the kitchen table. There was nothing dramatic about the morning. In fact, it felt strangely peaceful, the kind of calm that often appears when a person finally understands the shape of a situation they once found confusing. She sat by the window and looked down at the street, remembering another morning many years earlier when Daniel had rushed through the same kitchen on his way to catch the subway to his first job interview. He had been nervous then, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror while asking Margaret 3 different times whether the suit looked professional enough. She remembered laughing softly and telling him that confidence mattered more than any jacket or tie. Later that day, he called her from Midtown to say he had been offered the position. The excitement in his voice had filled the apartment like sunlight. Margaret had always believed those moments were the real rewards of motherhood, watching a child grow into someone capable and hopeful. Yet as she sat at the table now, she understood that time had quietly shifted the balance of their relationship. Daniel had built a new life surrounded by new influences, and somewhere along that path the simple loyalty between mother and son had become complicated. Margaret finished her coffee and reached for the folder in the desk drawer again, reviewing the documents with the same calm attention she had shown the previous day. The receipt from the bank confirmed the exact amount she transferred for the venue deposit months earlier, a sum large enough that the event coordinator had personally thanked her during their first conversation. Margaret remembered how Daniel sounded relieved after that transfer cleared. He had said it allowed them to secure the reception hall overlooking the Hudson River, the one Emily insisted was perfect for the evening celebration. Margaret had been happy to help because she believed weddings were meant to gather families together rather than push them apart. Now the folder lay open on the kitchen table beside the printed invitation and the quiet glow of her phone screen. Margaret read Rebecca Lawson's follow-up email once more, confirming the administrative policy they had discussed earlier. The message explained that final authorization for the event remained tied to the original financial contact unless an official change had been filed. Margaret had asked that question carefully during their call, not out of anger, but out of curiosity about how such arrangements worked behind the scenes. Rebecca had answered politely, unaware of the deeper family story connected to the reservation. Margaret closed the folder and folded her hands together for a moment, thinking about Daniel again. She imagined him somewhere downtown, perhaps meeting with vendors or reviewing final details for the ceremony. He likely believed everything was settled. The music, the flowers, the elegant reception hall beside the river. Margaret stood up and walked toward the window, watching the slow stream of traffic move along the avenue below. For decades she had lived in this city, and she knew how often life changed direction in quiet ways rather than dramatic ones. When she finally turned back toward the table, the invitation and the documents remained exactly where she left them, silent reminders that the coming weekend still depended on decisions that had not yet fully unfolded. Margaret picked up her phone again and read through the contact list until she found the name Rebecca Lawson. She did not press the call button yet. Instead, she placed the phone gently beside the invitation and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Because for the first time since that phone call earlier in the week, she realized that the story Daniel and Emily believed was already written might still contain a chapter they had never expected. Saturday morning arrived with a gray sky hanging low over Manhattan, the kind of quiet autumn morning that made the city feel slower than usual. Margaret Collins woke before her alarm, a habit she had carried for decades from the years when her work at the hospital required early shifts and long subway rides across the city. The apartment was still dim as she stepped into the kitchen and turned on the small lamp near the table. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of a train somewhere beneath the streets. Tomorrow Daniel would stand inside a beautiful reception hall overlooking the Hudson River, surrounded by guests who believed the celebration had come together effortlessly. Margaret imagined the room clearly. She had seen photographs of the venue when Daniel first showed it to her months earlier. Tall windows facing the water, warm lighting reflecting off polished floors. A long table prepared for speeches and champagne toasts. At that time Margaret pictured herself sitting quietly among the guests, watching her son step forward to begin the next chapter of his life. The image had felt natural, almost guaranteed, because mothers were usually part of those moments. Now that image existed only as a memory of an expectation that had quietly disappeared. Margaret prepared her coffee slowly and carried the cup to the window, looking down at the nearly empty street below. A light breeze pushed a few yellow leaves across the sidewalk while a delivery van paused at the corner before continuing downtown. New York never truly stopped moving, even on quiet mornings like this one. She took a small sip of coffee and allowed her thoughts to return once again to the conversation with Emily earlier in the week. The younger woman had spoken politely, almost gently, as if excluding a mother from her own son's wedding was simply a practical decision that required calm explanation. Margaret remembered how steady her own voice had sounded in response. She had not argued. She had not raised her tone. Instead, she had thanked Emily for letting her know. That calm response had surprised even Margaret herself at the time, but now she understood why it felt natural. After so many years of raising Daniel, she had learned that sometimes silence revealed more truth than confrontation ever could. Margaret placed the empty coffee cup in the sink and returned to the table where the folder and the invitation still rested side by side. The gold lettering on the invitation reflected softly in the kitchen light. Tomorrow evening the ceremony would begin, and dozens of people would gather believing that every detail had been finalized weeks ago. Margaret knew differently. The call with Rebecca Lawson 2 days earlier had confirmed something important, something that still existed quietly beneath the surface of all those wedding plans. She picked up her phone and read Rebecca's last email again, the message that politely outlined the administrative policy connected to the reservation. The words were simple and professional, yet they carried a quiet authority. Margaret understood that authority now in a way Daniel and Emily clearly did not. She folded the invitation and placed it carefully back on the table before opening her contact list once more. Rebecca Lawson's name appeared near the top of the screen. Margaret studied it for a moment, thinking about the years she had spent building a life that allowed Daniel to reach this moment in his own future. She did not feel anger toward him. She only felt the calm understanding that comes when someone finally sees the full picture of a situation that once seemed confusing. Outside the window, the clouds shifted slightly, allowing a thin line of sunlight to reach the buildings across the street. Margaret pressed the call button. The phone rang once, then twice, and when Rebecca answered, Margaret spoke in the same steady tone she had used throughout the week. She explained that she was calling to finalize a decision regarding the reception reservation connected to her financial authorization. The conversation remained brief and respectful. When the call ended, Margaret placed the phone gently beside the folder and looked once more toward the quiet city outside her window, knowing that by the time Daniel and Emily arrived at the venue tomorrow evening, they would discover that the story they believed was already settled had changed in a way neither of them had anticipated. Sunday evening arrived with a soft golden light stretching across the Hudson River, the kind of quiet glow that made Manhattan look almost peaceful despite the constant motion of the city. Inside the elegant reception hall Daniel and Emily had chosen months earlier, staff members moved quickly across the polished floor, adjusting chairs, and placing the final touches on the long tables prepared for the celebration. White linens covered every surface, and tall glass vases filled with pale flowers stood carefully arranged beneath the tall windows overlooking the water. Everything appeared exactly as it should for a wedding reception that had been planned for months. Outside the venue, a small line of guests began arriving, greeting one another warmly as they stepped through the entrance doors. Many of them had traveled across the city to attend this moment, expecting to witness the beginning of Daniel and Emily's married life, surrounded by music, speeches, and laughter. Daniel himself stood near the far end of the room beside the event coordinator's desk, dressed in a dark suit and adjusting the cuff of his sleeve while speaking quietly with Emily. She wore a calm expression, though her eyes occasionally scanned the room as if checking that every detail matched the image she had imagined during the long weeks of planning. From a distance, the couple appeared confident, certain that the evening would unfold exactly as they intended. Yet near the front desk, Rebecca Lawson held a tablet in her hands and studied the screen with a slightly puzzled expression. Only a few hours earlier she had received the final confirmation connected to the reservation, a message that arrived shortly after Margaret Collins placed her call the previous morning. Rebecca had processed the request carefully because the policies tied to large events required precise documentation. Now, as Daniel approached the desk to ask whether the reception schedule was ready to begin, Rebecca looked up with the same professional calm she always displayed when handling complicated arrangements. She explained politely that there had been an administrative change connected to the reservation earlier that day. Daniel frowned slightly, not understanding what she meant. Rebecca turned the tablet toward him and pointed to the updated record, which clearly stated that the financial authorization originally connected to Margaret Collins had been formally withdrawn. The venue policy required that such authorization remain active for the event to proceed exactly as scheduled. Without it, the reservation could not move forward under the same terms that had been secured months earlier. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment, confusion spreading across his face as the meaning of Rebecca's words slowly settled in. Emily stepped closer beside him, reading the message herself and realizing that the name Margaret Collins still appeared prominently in the official documentation. Around them, the reception hall continued to glow with elegant preparation, yet a quiet tension had entered the room as the couple absorbed the unexpected information. Rebecca spoke calmly, explaining that the situation was not permanent, but that a new financial authorization would be required immediately if they wished to continue with the reservation that evening. The solution was simple in theory, yet the timing made everything suddenly complicated. Daniel looked across the beautifully decorated hall toward the doors where guests were beginning to gather, unaware that the celebration they expected might not proceed the way anyone had imagined. At that exact moment, several miles away on the Upper West Side, Margaret Collins sat quietly beside the window of her apartment, watching the fading sunlight reflect against the buildings across the street. Her phone rested silently on the table beside the folded invitation, and although the city outside continued its endless rhythm, Margaret felt no urgency at all, only the calm certainty that sometimes the quietest decisions carried the greatest consequences. Inside the reception hall, overlooking the Hudson River, the quiet tension continued to spread as Daniel Collins stared at the screen Rebecca Lawson had turned toward him. The elegant room behind him was ready for celebration, yet the message displayed on the tablet had changed everything in a way he had never considered. Emily Parker read the notice again, her expression shifting from confusion to a tight silence as the meaning settled into place. The original financial authorization connected to the reservation had been withdrawn earlier that day by Margaret Collins. Without that authorization, the agreement securing the reception hall was no longer active under the terms that had allowed them to reserve the space months before. Rebecca spoke calmly, explaining that the venue policy required a replacement authorization before the evening could proceed exactly as planned. The solution itself was simple, yet the timing placed Daniel and Emily in a difficult position. The amount required to restore the reservation was the same deposit Margaret had quietly covered during the early stages of planning. Daniel felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest as he looked across the beautifully arranged room. Guests were already arriving at the entrance, greeting one another and admiring the decorations without realizing that the couple standing near the front desk had just discovered something important about the foundation of their celebration. For the first time that evening, Daniel thought about the phone call Emily had made earlier in the week, the conversation in which his mother had been told it would be better if she did not attend. At the time, he convinced himself it was a practical decision meant to avoid tension, yet standing there now he understood how different the situation truly looked. Margaret had not argued. She had not protested. She had simply stepped back in silence, leaving Daniel to believe the story would continue without her. Emily looked toward him, her voice quieter than before as she asked whether he could arrange the payment immediately. Daniel hesitated because the truth was simple. The deposit had always been more than he expected, which was why his mother's help had mattered so much months earlier. Rebecca remained professional and patient, explaining that the venue would hold the reservation for a short time while the matter was resolved. The room itself remained unchanged, glowing softly beneath the tall windows while the river moved slowly outside in the fading evening light. After several long seconds, Daniel reached for his phone and stepped away from the desk. The sound of conversations from arriving guests drifted through the hall as he walked toward the window overlooking the water. For years he had believed that independence meant moving forward without relying on the past, but now he realized that many of the milestones in his life had been quietly supported by the woman he had asked to stay away from this very moment. Several miles away, Margaret Collins still sat beside the window of her apartment, the evening sky slowly darkening beyond the buildings of the Upper West Side. Her phone rested silently on the table beside the folded invitation, and the city lights were beginning to flicker on one by one along the avenue below. Margaret was not watching the clock, and she was not waiting for anything in particular. She simply understood that respect within a family could not be demanded through anger or force. Sometimes it arrived only after people were forced to see the truth they had chosen to ignore. In the quiet reflection of the window glass, she saw her own calm expression looking back at her, and for the first time that week she felt certain that whatever happened inside that reception hall along the Hudson River, Daniel Collins would remember this night for the rest of his life.